Despite Nintendo continuing to release Fire Emblem titles on the GameCube, DS, and Wii, the series struggled over the next several years, with sales never quite reaching those of Sword of Seals way back in 2002. That is, until Fire Emblem Awakening. An all-in from both Intelligent Systems and Nintendo that would either make or break the series for good. In the months leading up to February 2013, Nintendo launched a massive marketing campaign to promote Awakening, utilizing everything from teasers featuring characters from older games who would appear in Awakening, to an exclusive console that would come packaged with the game. And because it was released to a rather bare-bones lineup of 3DS titles, Awakening did extremely well, and reports say that the sales figures generated undoubtedly saved the series. So what's all the fuss about? Awakening is very much a try at a best of Fire Emblem, bringing back most of the mechanical elements from the Game Boy Advance era, as well as some from the SNES, a fresh cast of main characters, and a narrative vaguely connected to the original games. It also cast its net wide, appealing to newer players with a lower barrier of entry, and throwing bones to older players with familiar DLC maps and characters. Also worth mentioning is the sheer size of the game. It boasts 25 main story campaigns, 23 side missions, and another 25 DLC chapters, ensuring that almost everyone will find something to enjoy. But as a result of trying to pack so much in, I feel that many areas of the game suffer, especially when compared with earlier titles in the series, and I'll explain exactly why I think that over the course of this video, so strap in, because there's a lot to cover. Awakening brings the 3D battles from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn to the handheld and does them one better, having a selection of camera angles and playback functions to play with, as well as fun effects like slowdown on KOs. The animations very nearly return to the quick, dynamic, energetic ones of Genealogy, and although I still prefer those, I'm willing to say that that's just my personal preference. There are nice touches though. I like how the Cavaliers pat their horses, for example. Really the only problems I have are that the critical hits are remarkably boring compared to the GBA games, and the animations can sometimes run a tad long, but there is a fast forward button, so it's not too bad. If this were all that was changed, I would say that the series is improved by Awakening's art style, but unfortunately it's also the first handheld title to make the transition to full cinematic cutscenes, complete with motion capture and everything. This is fine, and the practice actually started with Path of Radiance, but with a lot of games taking a more cinematic approach to storytelling, it brings up the question of whether it plays to an interactive medium's strength. Ideally, actions and events happening on screen should involve the player through gameplay as much as possible. This was already done almost perfectly in Genealogy. Of course, this is likely due to the limitations of the hardware, but it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Remember this part? Of course you do, it's tragic. But look at what's going on here as far as gameplay is concerned. Quan and his troops ride in just south of your position at the castle. It's the promise of fresh reinforcements, which is certainly welcome, but it's also the main character, and one of the protagonist's best friends. So naturally you decide to ride toward him. Then the Wyverns show up. And since you're awfully close to him, it feels like you can just reach him in time to help. But the sand slows you down, and every turn that you crawl toward him is agonizing, until you realize that you're not going to be able to save him. And despite your efforts, Quan and Ethlyn die in what is ultimately a scripted event. But when I first played through this part, it did not feel like it. I panicked trying to get my units down there as fast as I could. To be fair, not all of the NPC battles in Genealogy were this engaging. This one in Cilicia, for example, I found rather annoying. But with the Quan example, it's the fact that the player is engaged through gameplay in a major story event. Cutscenes can be used to great effect to establish a character or create an atmosphere, but more often than not, they take players out of the game. There are some good ones in Awakening, but for example, why couldn't we have played through this bit with some of the child characters? There's even a perfect segue there. Even if there were only like 2 child characters, it wouldn't matter because the objective on that imaginary map wouldn't be to kill everything, it would be to get out of there. We could see the devastation and the overwhelming odds and get a sneak peek at the boss we'll soon be up against and perhaps come to understand the character's plight a little bit more. These cutscenes aren't game-breaking or even really a problem, but it does indicate that Fire Emblem is gravitating toward the recent trends in game design, whether or not they really work to its advantage, which we'll see more examples of in the next section. One issue with Fire Emblem as a series is that it lacks a central conceit. It's hard to say that the series as a whole is about any one thing. The Metal Gear Solid series, for example, is about identity. Silent Hill is about occultism. But Fire Emblem lacks a real idea at its core. most likely due to its original development as little more than an experiment. The games take place in different times, with different characters in different kingdoms fighting for different things, with the only recurring element being the Fire Emblem, which itself often plays second fiddle to the subtitle of any particular game. The identity of Fire Emblem instead lies in its gameplay, which is one of the only unique things about it as a game. If you hear a person say Fire Emblem style, you know exactly what they mean. This is why Awakening's changes to the mechanics are not only alarming, but perhaps even destructive to the series' identity. Permanent death has been a staple of the series since the very first game until 2010, when the Japanese-only remake of the third game offered the option to turn it off. The decision for permanent character death is an interesting and an important one, not only because it makes the game considerably more challenging, but because it taps into the roots of the TRPG as a game where you have to think carefully about your moves, and consider your options before you make a mistake that can cost you the game. Thematically, it emphasizes the high-stakes combat of war, in which tactical decisions actually matter for the people doing the fighting. The fact that the characters were even given personalities would seem to support this idea. Your units aren't just units. They're characters, with responsibilities, goals, and friends, and if you make a poor tactical decision, you're punished. You lose that character, and his story ends there. It touches on the fragility of human life that Genealogy absolutely nailed. The characters in the first half of that game are heroes, certainly, but they're not invincible. Quan dies wielding the Gaebolg, after all. Permanent death emphasizes that the player's moment-to-moment choices and mistakes matter. The move away from permanent death represents the abandonment of a core design philosophy that makes the gameplay, the characters, and the narrative stronger as a cohesive whole. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it is still an option left up to the player, but I think even considering it, let alone implementing it, is a mistake that makes the game weaker. The gameplay and the characters are weaker without that element of risk, and the narrative no longer reflects a war in which people can die. And it's also worth mentioning that it's still a sore spot for many of the people at Intelligent Systems. When it comes to issues that are exclusively Awakenings, perhaps the most baffling change to the mechanics is the auto-battle option. In Chapter 2, Crom and Frederick introduced the concept of letting the AI take over for the player during the fighting portions. Although they point out that it's not a guaranteed win, the implementation of this idea shifts the focus of the game from the gameplay to the narrative and the characters, effectively telling the player that this fighting bit isn't important, that he can skip this boring part and get to the good stuff. To be fair, I don't think this is an inherently bad idea. In fact, in making this series, I had to play through each game several times to record different conversations, and having an option like this sometimes would have been nice. But I think it's something that should, at the very least, be reserved for the second playthrough, not the second chapter. Setting aside for a moment the fact that the game can effectively play itself from Chapter 2, this isn't where the problems end. There is almost no variety in the missions. Objectives literally alternate between rout the enemy and defeat the commander, and things rarely get more complex than that. For contrast, one of the most exciting maps from Blazing Sword is Chapter 26, in which the crew learns that the prince is to be assassinated and rushes to his aid. It is an extremely tense map. The main objective is to protect the prince, which is already a problem, because you start at the top of the map and have to travel in a J shape to even reach him, and he will die if you waste time. There's also 2 characters to recruit, one of which is required to recruit the other on the opposite side of the map. 4 chests to loot on opposite sides of the map, 2 bosses, one of which can ruin your day because she has range and power, and there's Fog of War to boot. It's a perfect storm to be sure, but it is a great map. There is nothing even half as interesting in Awakening. There's little to distract or draw the player's attention. Chests and villages are often placed on the way to objectives, which in earlier titles meant removing a potentially valuable unit from the battle for a turn or perhaps several, depending on how far away it was. Reinforcements, flanking attacks, or any actual strategy utilized on the enemy's part occur a total of 6 times in 25 chapters, and only once do they ever flank you and potentially cause problems. It's just not enjoyable to play because it's not satisfying to play. There's very little challenge, at least not the level of challenge I was accustomed to having played several of the earlier titles. In the same vein, the brand new pair-up system is also worth mentioning. Like the trainee classes in the Sacred Stones, which also make a return in Awakening, there is virtually no reason not to use pair-up. Many players say that the increases you can get through this system are ridiculously broken, and you can easily pair up two characters into an unstoppable killing machine, and this is certainly true, and it makes the game that much easier. But the real problem with it is that there is zero risk involved. Pair Up replaced the rescue system from the GBA games, which I think is an infinitely better system because there is still an element of risk there. It's not a guaranteed out. If a character is in trouble, there's a couple of things to consider before you rush in and pick him up. First of all, you have to have a character nearby with enough constitution to rescue him, and this isn't always easy, because constitution doesn't increase like other stats. Next, you have to make sure that the rescuer isn't going to be in danger, because the rescuing unit suffers significant penalties to his speed and skill, and he could very well be doubled and possibly killed by just about anything if he gets attacked. Now at this point you might be saying, White Comet, just play on a higher difficulty level, you scrub. And it's true that Awakening offers plenty to choose from, but I have a problem with this as well. The first 5 games had no difficulty option at all. It was all on a fixed difficulty, which forced players to formulate a solid strategy to get through the chapters, because they were hard as nails. It was your strategy that kept your units alive. The player actually had to be good at the game to make it to the end. In the titles after Thracia 776, however, the higher difficulties became less about how skilled you are at the game, or how sound your strategy is, and became more about where your personal frustration threshold lies. There's little to improve on or master when you're up against an RNG that very much favors the enemy. And to me, there's little satisfaction to be gained from that. Unless a game encourages mastery of its systems, like any Platinum game, the Arkham series, or even MGS, I don't think it really warrants a huge selection of difficulty options. I feel that all of these elements emphasize just how little effort was put into the actual gameplay portions of Awakening, and I question whether this is a good direction for the series to go, especially since the gameplay is the foundation of Fire Emblem. To trivialize it, as Awakening does, is to strip Fire Emblem of any of the personality it had. And if the gameplay of Fire Emblem is effectively removed, well, what's left? As far as the characters are concerned, Awakening repeats many of the missteps of the Sacred Stones, but to an even greater extent. The problems start with motivation, which is arguably the most important piece of information about a character, and for many of the characters in Awakening, I couldn't find one. The starting group of characters all belong to Crom's group, the Shepherds, but it's never really made clear what the Shepherds are exactly. Are they a division of the army? One led by the prince? A mercenary group? A D&D group? They never say. Although I don't know where they found the information, the fan wiki describes it as a volunteer group of fighters led by Crom. Okay, but this brings up even more issues. You need a motivation to join a voluntary group, and a lot of the Shepherds don't seem to have one. Vicky has his obvious rivalry with Crom, but why does he fight? Is that the only thing that drives him? For Stahl and Muriel, it's even murkier. Why is Stahl even in this elite group of fighters? He doesn't seem like a very competent soldier. Why does he fight? What drives him? What makes him a shepherd while a proper soldier like Cordelia is just a soldier? Muriel's thing is that she likes to learn and study, and if this is the case, then surely a lab or a university would be better suited to that pursuit than a battlefield. What is she doing in this group? Even when the idea of motivation is brought up, the characters never say why they fight, and it is infuriating. Donald is the only one who really tells us his motivation, and it is one of the most well-worn cliches out there. The country boy who realizes that there's more to life than just the farm, and by gosh, he goes out there and makes a name for himself. This isn't complex stuff. A good character needs cogent motivations and a plot with difficulties to overcome. And that difficulties part is the other problem with the characters. To be fair, some of the characters do have struggles, but the problem is that they are in no way related to the bigger picture, which further pulls apart the game as a whole, driving a wedge between the characters and the narrative this time. You would think that Crom and Lissa would struggle with losing their only family, but it never comes up. You would think that the loss of Cordelia's entire unit would affect her in some significant way, but the topic only ever comes up in her chat with the Avatar. Virion abandoned his people to save himself. You would think that that would weigh at least a bit on his mind, but it only shows up in his supports with Pan and the Wyvern girl whom I can't pronounce the name of. And these are the characters who have legitimate struggles. Then there are characters like Lon Q, who is already the best swordsman in Regna Ferox, so he struggles with learning how to talk to girls. Lissa is worried about not being princess-like enough, and Kellum wants to be noticed. These are the struggles of characters embroiled in a potentially world-ending war. Do you see what I mean about the disconnect? The quirks from Sacred Stones are back as well, but this time it's arguably even worse, because the characters are very much defined by these baseline traits, and very little else is ever revealed about them or paid any mind to. Sumia loves Crom, and she's clumsy. Cordelia loves Crom, and she's good at everything. Tharja loves the player's avatar and hexes. You know everything you need to know about a character the moment you meet them, and the fact that the characters remind the player of their quirks every time they level up is, to me, obnoxious. Anything else you happen to learn about the character, that Stahl's father is an apothecary for example, isn't important to understanding the character's place in the war or motivation for fighting the war, and serves as little more than padding. To clear up any confusion, there is a difference between backstory and development. Let's revisit Sword of Seals for a moment because Lu gets both. Lu's backstory adds to our understanding of the character, why he has to fight, why he worries about his brother, why he shares, why he cares about the kids younger than himself. And Lu develops in his friendship with Melody when he decides that just because a person is from Byrne, that doesn't make her evil. The characters in Awakening only get the backstory, not the development. What does the fact that Kellum likes to garden add to our understanding of the character? One of my biggest problems with the game is that a good deal of the supports are overtly comedic, because there's nothing funnier than war, right? It makes it feel like Awakening takes place in two entirely different worlds, one in which the main story is going on, and the other in which the support conversations take place. There are scenes like Emeren's suicide followed by Sumia goofing off with flower fortunes, and I was never sure what I was supposed to be feeling. It's important to keep in mind that all Fire Emblem games do take place during a war, which isn't fun for anyone, least of all the soldiers, but the characters in Awakening are just having a grand old time. They have time to build theaters, bake cakes, and even learn a full curriculum. The characters don't act like soldiers fighting a war, but more like characters in a sitcom, each of their supports being some zany episode like the one with Vicky and the Avatar, or Lucina and Cynthia freaking out about a bug. Ultimately, I found it remarkably difficult to care about any of the characters in Awakening, because I couldn't understand, relate to, or identify with any of them. To revisit genealogy, while many players may not deal with issues as complex as Lex's, I would wager that players can relate to or at least understand characters like Azel, and his inferiority complex when it comes to his older brother Alvis. I would imagine that not many players have an insatiable desire to inflict pain like Henry, although it has to be said that this bit did make me laugh. What I don't understand is how the tone has done a complete 180 from the way it was handled in just the previous game, Heroes of Light and Shadow. There was an avatar in that game as well who could have chats with the characters, which added a bit of otherwise absent personality to them and helped the player to relate to them, and many of them were quite sobering. In Norn's case, your character was her inspiration to join the army. Your character and Lindy are both orphans and promise to watch out for each other on the field. The concept of forming a connection with the player seems completely lost in Awakening. The final character issue with Awakening is that it is overly focused on the relationships between the characters. And as a result of this, Awakening plays more like a dating sim than a tactics game. And that's fine, I guess, but I didn't want to play a dating sim. I wanted to play a Fire Emblem game. But that's just me. The thing is that it's not a good dating sim either. There are good ones out there. Katawa Shoujo comes to mind, and the Persona series manages to have engaging characters with actual development in addition to some pretty sweet dungeon crawling. Awakening simplifies its gameplay and puts the spotlight on a selection of predictable, rushed, and not particularly well-written interactions between the characters. And these relationships take precedence over everything else in the game, even to the point of apparently postponing the war for 2 years while Crom gets married. Did they just leave the Risen be for 2 years? Because that was definitely not sorted out. The romance angle has always struck me as a bit out of place in a game ostensibly about war and tactics, but up until the Sacred Stones at least, the justification for it had always been there. In the first game, the only relationship is the one that develops canonically between Marth and Sheeta, and it makes sense. We get the impression that there's history that we don't see between the two, but none of that matters. For now, there are much bigger fish to fry, namely restoring Marth's kingdom. The romance is saved until the end of the game when it's more tonally appropriate, not unlike other JRPGs like Chrono Trigger. In Genealogy, it was not only a central mechanic, as much of the second generation depended on how the player paired the first generation characters, but a central theme as well. It also made sense because the characters fought together for several years, giving them plenty of time to realistically forge those relationships. Sword of Seals gave the option to develop friendships and rivalries, but reserved relationships for the protagonist alone, and Blazing Sword needed the relationships to preserve the canon of Sword of Seals. The Sacred Stones, however, is where the developers seem unsure of what to do with the series, and start pulling from earlier games without real justification for it. The relationships in Sacred Stones don't serve a greater purpose. They're in there because that's what players want, right? The series has grown increasingly indulgent since then, and Awakening takes it to some real cringe-worthy levels, marking one of the only times I've ever felt genuinely uncomfortable playing a video game. Maybe it's better in Japanese, I don't know, or maybe they just have a team of 12-year-olds working over at localization, but writers, lines like this are embarrassing. To everyone. Your parents, your significant others, critics who defend games as having some wider literary significance. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. I can look past all of this though if it's in service to a better story. After all, that's what tropes and archetypes are used for in other texts, to put emphasis on the story. So let's see what we've got, shall we? To start with, I will say that I quite like the intro. It works on both a mechanical level, getting us familiar with the combat quickly, and from a story perspective it starts us in medias res and shows us killing the character on the box art. Awesome. I think this is spot on as far as an introduction to the genre is concerned. It doesn't hold your hand unless you let it, and it goes without saying that I think it's much better mechanically than Blazing Sword's plodding 10-chapter-long introduction. Speaking of Blazing Sword, the idea of a player character returns in Awakening, but this time the character is much more fleshed out. Rather than simply entering a name and a birthday and effectively disappearing for the rest of the game, the avatar in Awakening can take part in combat and is highly customizable, enabling the player to choose everything from hair color and voice to combat style and specialization, not to mention that he has a significant role in the story, and this is one of the strangest narrative choices in Awakening, the shift of focus from the main lord to the player's avatar. But this ties into the rest of the plot, so let's get that out of the way first. And let's play a game while we're at it. I'll summarize the plot, and you count the cliches. The story begins with your character waking up in a field with amnesia. Everything's fine for a while, and then, surprise, zombies! After that, we meet a mysterious lad named Marth, who tells us that the world is going to end. And not much more than that before he leaves. Guess it's not that big of a deal. We reach Lycée, which is just a little slice of heaven. It values peace above all, and although things look grim now, the Queen keeps everyone in line with her calming presence. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, turns out those stalwart chaps we ran into earlier happened to be the Prince and Princess. Imagine that! Shortly after, we meet our ragtag group of troops. We then travel to Regna Ferox, where our party are taken for imposters. Fortunately though, we're able to forge an alliance with Ferox, because it just happens to be apparently the very moment of election time. What luck! We next hear talk of a fellow with a none too subtle moniker, the Mad King of Pelagia. I could keep this up for a while longer, but I think you get the point by now. To be fair, after this point the narrative actually does do something interesting, provided you're still paying attention and haven't been bored into a coma from what preceded it. It turns out that Lycée wasn't always the beacon of righteousness and innocence that they were made out to be. The former ruler, Crom's father, slaughtered hundreds of Pelagians in some religious crusade. I like this because this revelation ought to instill a bit of doubt in the player and make him consider the moral grayness of war, and how the good guys may not always be good, which could have been a very interesting theme, but this is promptly forgotten as we go on an extended slaughterfest not only in Pelagia but in Valm as well. And we're shortly back into cliché territory when we learn that the big bad is your father, which is a pretty shameless one. We have the distraction guy that will almost certainly be going to his death, but don't worry, he'll be just fine. There's a brother who nobly sacrifices himself to protect his sister, who only comes to understand the significance of his sacrifice after his death, and of course the old Fire Emblem standbys, divine weapons, the enemy general who is loyal to a fault, and so on. Awakening's story is cliché after cliché with nothing original or even remotely creative. It doesn't do anything we haven't seen before, even in the Fire Emblem series. nor does it play with this plethora of tropes and cliches at all. It doesn't subvert or comment on them, just uses them as plot points and carries right along. It is some of the laziest writing I have ever seen in a video game. The villains are what have come to be standard Fire Emblem villains, which is a shame. I thought Gangrel had the potential to be interesting. He is kind of in the right to at least be suspicious of Emerin, and combined with Lissei's questionable past, could have made for an interesting and sympathetic villain. He has more motivation than any shepherd for going to war, that's for sure, but there's no effort made to actually humanize him. Instead, he constantly calls for blood, provokes our heroes, kidnaps important people, and blatantly lies. He is a clown most of the time, which is thoroughly disappointing when he could have been a really great, understandable character. The other secondary antagonist, Walhart, is just in it for good old world domination, and so is Valadar for that matter, only he wants to destroy the world for some reason. None of the antagonists in Awakening are complex. They have no motivation beyond simply being a bad guy, and they have no redeeming factors whatsoever. They don't act like people, they're caricatures, and that is boring. When it comes to villains, King Trabant is one of my favorite in the Fire Emblem series, because he's not a bad guy simply because he's a bad guy, but he's willing to be the bad guy to do what's right for his country. He acts like a person pushed to the breaking point, fed up with watching his people struggle and suffer, sick of diplomacy and proper channels. Manster is just over the border, and if he and his army can conquer it, then damn the consequences. His people will be better for it, even if he never sees it. Not only this, but at the end of the Thracia arc, he realizes that he is the bad guy, and trusts the future of Thracia to his son. Now that's a character I can understand. And when I finally had to take him down, it was a bit bittersweet, because it didn't necessarily have to be that way. After all, he and the prince wanted the same thing. I had a hard time feeling anything other than bored killing the antagonists in Awakening. One other thing that bothers me is the lack of transitions between scenes and maps. To illustrate, the intro to Chapter 24 of Blazing Sword sees the crew sneaking into Byrne's royal palace to find clues as to the whereabouts of the Fire Emblem. They learn what they need to and make their exit, but a group of Wyvern riders spots Nils outside and the others run to his aid. This all takes place on the battle map, which is what I mean. I know how I got into this situation. A particularly egregious example of the lack of transitions in Awakening is Chapter 18, where we see the group talking outside of a volcano. Sayuri says that the player character's plan is risky, and then we're suddenly standing on the map surrounded by lava. How did we get there? And what exactly was the plan? Did it work? There's a lot there that's not really accounted for between the scene and the map that I find quite jarring. This may be the most nitpicky of my complaints, but it's one that stands out to me, that makes it seem like Awakening lacks the coherence of earlier titles. The names of the locations are another minor thing that nevertheless make Awakening feel like a different game altogether. Previous titles had Lefkandith, Rivaux, Tirnanog, Cathalet, and Caer Pelin, while Awakening has South Town, the North Road, Border Sands, Border Wastes, the Long Fort. I can only imagine the sleepless nights that some poor writer had to suffer through to come up with those gems. Let's get into some story specifics, shall we? I've already briefly touched on the Fire Emblem and how it's of relatively little importance in almost any other title. In Awakening, however, it's put front and center, referenced several times throughout the game, but like the Shepherds, we're never really clear on what exactly it does. So it grants wishes. Oh no, it saves people. Look, it does something important, okay? And everybody's out to get it. Even this guy. You know, there's a word for something like that in cinema. Something Griffin? Anyway, we later learn that the emblem allows one of exalted blood to channel Naga's power. But Lucina doesn't know anything about the emblem, and managed to communicate with Naga just fine for her ritual. And you would presumably need to channel the power of one of the gods to go back in time, right? The emblem also would have allowed Valadar to summon Grima, so it's apparently not limited to the Exalt bloodline and not just to summon Naga. And what on earth did Valm want with it? The point is that the Fire Emblem is a magical plot device that can do whatever it needs to in order to move the plot forward. and it's again pretty lazy. In earlier games, schools of magic had more detail put into how they operate in the narrative than the namesake of the entire series does in Awakening. Let's talk about dark magic for a minute to illustrate. In Blazing Sword, we see that dark magic is dangerous. Not only to the enemy units, it's ridiculously strong, but it's often slow and inaccurate. But from a lore perspective, it's also dangerous to the user. In a conversation with Canas, Nino points out that he sometimes looks scary while using it. In another chat with Pent, he elaborates on why, explaining that dark magic requires inviting the darkness into oneself, and the user has to exercise considerable caution lest he succumb to the darkness, which several characters in the story already have. Canas mentions 3 of his brothers who were in a pretty sorry state. Bramamon, the hero associated with dark magic, no longer seems to be human and appears as a reflection of the person speaking to him, and of course Nergal, who, in his pursuit of power, forgot the very reason he wanted that power. In Sword of Seals, Ray and Neem are the only dark magic users, and although there's an additional one compared with Blazing Sword, the extremes in the characters' ages make them seem like exceptions rather than token dark magic users. Ray admits that he has a great deal to learn about dark magic, and his goal is to make it more well known throughout Eleb. What's interesting about this is that Sword of Seals' story takes place approximately 20 years after Blazing Sword, so dark magic seems to have been forgotten or become taboo in the interim, possibly because it was so dangerous to the users. After all, Nergal very nearly destroyed Eleb. In the Sacred Stones, Noel and Natasha spend their support discussing the interesting, albeit more simple dynamic between dark and light magic, in which dark magic is a stand-in for science or knowledge, and light magic represents faith. And although that support doesn't really go anywhere, it nevertheless shows that there's a surprising amount of depth to dark magic in Fire Emblem, which in other games would involve spooky ghosts and a bunch of other nonsense. It's also worth mentioning that in Awakening, dark mages are the harbingers of pestilence, famine, and doom. So much for that depth. Speaking of depth, it should be noted that Awakening does have more solid themes than, say, Sacred Stones. Even if it isn't exactly challenging, I can forgive it because it has the right idea. Awakening is about fate and whether the choices people make can affect their destiny. Awakening makes the argument that they can, as we see several times throughout the game. The problem with it is that with the exception of the very last one, the choices the player makes throughout the game have zero effect on the outcome of the story. Choosing one or the other changes the dialogue immediately following it only very slightly, and your choice is never brought up again. To return briefly to recent trends in game design, Awakening incorporates its player choice in a much more ham-fisted way than in previous titles, which was mostly done in the supports. The relationships the characters forged in earlier titles had tangential effects on the story. For example, whether you did it because, as Wrath says, Sakeans stick together, or whatever, pairing Wrath and Lyn sees Lyn return to Sake at the end of the game and give up her title. Even if it's just a small bit of text at the end of the game, the player is able to see that his or her choice to pair those two mattered. It changed the story. For crying out loud, even choosing a route in Sacred Stones has a more significant effect on the story than the vast majority of choices in Awakening. In these earlier games, player choice was something that ran in the background rather than being the main attraction, with a big marquee popping up every now and then asking me to choose. Ultimately, Awakening's message that your choices matter is pretty disingenuous when, in the context of the game, your choices don't matter at all. Let's talk about time travel. I certainly don't understand it, and nobody else does either. And as such, I don't really want to get into the minutiae of how it operates in Awakening, because it's confusing for everybody. But because it's essentially what enables the story to occur, it needs to be mentioned. We first meet Lucina in Chapter 1, where the very first thing she does is save Lissa's life. Later on in Chapter 6, she warns the crew, and saves both Emerin and Crom. Although this changes later when she says he was just gravely wounded, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the context of the rest of the story, but anyway. After these bits, she disappears for a while and is later confronted by Crom about it, asking why she wouldn't stay with them, presumably to tell them what they were up against and how to avoid her future, which is a reasonable question. I mean, that is her goal, right? She says she didn't want to risk altering history any more than necessary, and wanted to change only the chain of events leading to Grima's resurrection. The question is, how does she determine what's necessary and what's not? And how does she know this sequence of events that led to Grima's return, considering she doesn't even know who kills her father? At the very least, surely saving Lissa's life would alter the future more than telling the group how to avoid that future. What I mean to say is that there's no reason she couldn't have told them all of this the first time they met. There was no need for the disguise either. In fact, it could have added a good deal of much-needed tension to the story if she were just honest. If a character from the future shows up and says that the world goes to hell, but she doesn't know how or why, there are suddenly stakes and repercussions for every single action. The player's choices would be a wonderful place for these stakes, as he or she would wonder if maybe this choice or the other leads to the destruction of the world. Finally, let's return to the problem with the shift of focus. Chrom is still the main lord, and you still get a game over if he dies. But your character is very much the main character. The story revolves around him, his amnesia, his relationship to Valadar, his relationship to Grima, and his choice of how to dispatch Grima. Indeed, Chrom does nothing even remotely heroic throughout the story unless you let him get the last hit on Grima. This is a strange direction for Fire Emblem. Even in Heroes of Light and Shadow, in which the player also had an avatar, the narrative followed Marth. The difference between Heroes and Awakening is that in Heroes the player's avatar is part of a bigger story. He's not the catalyst around which the story revolves. Despite the argument that most games are wish fulfillment, power fantasy, whatever, it's not often that games go this far, putting a player-created character in the driver's seat, and those that do aren't often focused on narrative. They're sandboxes like Skyrim. There is a reason for this, because it makes the player into a hero, and when this is handled poorly, it comes off as masturbatory and desperate more than anything, and I reckon this is why our old friend Shozo Kaga didn't think it would happen. This is especially the case in Awakening, where the characters are falling over themselves to make the player feel good about himself, which is really creepy more often than not. They never waste an opportunity to tell the player how much he's grown, or how much they'll appreciate him, or how he's surely going down in history. Oh, where would we be without you, player? Nobody seems capable of thinking for themselves or formulating an idea of their own. Whenever a problem crops up, they all complain about it for a while, and then turn slack-jawed to the avatar and wait for him to sort things out. The biggest problem with the narrative and the game as a whole is that rather than tell a story, it is one big, blatantly transparent exercise in indulging the player, which is so far removed from the Fire Emblem series that it feels like a different game altogether. If you enjoy Fire Emblem Awakening, that's fine. We can still be friends. I even think it's a decent game as far as the pick up and play style is concerned, and I can see why a lot of people enjoy it, but it is not a good Fire Emblem game. And what's disappointing about it to me is that it seems terrified of any trace of maturity, complexity, or ambiguity. The simple gameplay, vapid characters, and perfunctory story all tie into this one idea. Fire Emblem Awakening isn't interested in any of the things that made Fire Emblem worth playing. What originally made the game great has been forgotten in favor of mechanics that cater to an entirely different audience. There is no element of risk in Awakening. Even at the end, your character comes back just fine regardless of how many bonds you've developed. The characters, rather than complex, relatable characters with flaws and struggles, exist to be paired and sate the player's desire to play matchmaker. The narrative is written with recycled ideas, cliches, and masturbatory fluff that doesn't make the player think or challenge him in any way. It is the epitome of puerile entertainment. And when I remember that it was in fact adults who wrote this garbage, it makes my stomach turn. And for those developers to suggest that this is the crowning achievement of the series, that this is what Fire Emblem is all about, is utterly ridiculous. Next time we'll be taking a brief look at the future of Fire Emblem and where the series can go from here. I'll see you then.